And we're back on Inside the Ropes, and this week we've got a very special guest, one of two special guests. This guy was a big fan of ECW and decided to put his passion into filmmaking and make a documentary about ECW. It's been a long labour of love for him for the last 13 years. He's one of the directors and filmmakers of Barbed Wire City, the Unauthorised Story of Extreme Championship Wrestling. It's John Philapavage. John, welcome to Inside the Ropes.
Hey Kenny, thanks for having me across the pond, as they
say. Indeed. So I've got to be honest. First of all, I hadn't really heard about Barbed Wire City prior to this year. And I think a lot of people, and I don't think this is a bad thing to say initially, I think when you hear that there's another thing being released to do with ECW, the initial reaction is, oh God, not again, because there's been so many things brought out about it. But then I watched the documentary, and it's a really different perspective on ECW, and it's a really unique one as well. And you've not paid me to say that, so but it's definitely something that I think for people like maybe me, who at the beginning were a bit sceptical, I think people should bear that in mind. It is a very unique look at ECW. But I guess let's kind of take it back to the beginning for you. Like, how did you first?
Can I quick address that, Kenny?
Yeah,
real
sure.
Quick. Because no, I understand that. People in the wrestling, like hardcore wrestling fans, they view things through the lens of being hardcore wrestling fans. And I also think that there's like this misconception out there. Well, it's not a full misconception, but I was a fan of ECW in the 90s. That's how I got interested in their story. Kevin Kiernan, my partner, is not a wrestling fan, and doesn't really follow wrestling. He's very aware of it. Obviously, we've been working on and off for 13 years, but he's not a fan. And very early on in this project, I kind of took my fan, and you've seen it, so you know it's not like a fan piece necessarily, or I don't feel it is anyway.
No.
I was not making this because I was a giant ECW fan. I was interested in the story because I was a big ECW fan, but pretty early on in the process, we're talking like sometime in 2001, it became a serious documentary to me, and that kind of dovetails into what we were saying before is the uphill battle that we're kind of fighting in the wrestling market, and we're making some traction. Obviously, the first place you would go with a product like this, because it is about pro wrestling, is pro wrestling fans. And inside of that I'll call it a market, or especially the hardcore wrestling fan newsletter internet bubble, there's definitely that perception of like, oh, there's so much stuff out there about ECW. I'm not in the wrestling business, so I wanted to make a film that was accessible to everybody, because inside of the wrestling universe, like ECW is this very well-known thing. Outside of it, it's not. And I felt like we could really make a film that was both enjoyable to fans with a different perspective, and also to people who haven't heard of it, who are into like niche subcultures. Because I'm somebody who just goes on Netflix or goes to film festivals and just watches documentaries about things I don't really know about, because I'm fascinated by subcultures and humanizing people within misunderstood subcultures.
Yeah. So
I just wanted to get that out there, that it's like, I understand, which is good, because then people see it and they're like, oh, this is different. This is like a real documentary, instead of, something that was made by like a wrestling company or wrestling people. That's kind of like ECW's greatest hits, which is kind of why I get annoyed. Sometimes people, when they're trying to help us, advertise what we're doing as a history of ECW, and obviously we have historical elements to ECW, but that's not really the main focus of the film.
Mm-hmm.
It has a lot more to do with the subculture, with the people, the synergistic thing between fans, staff, and wrestlers, this idea of this cause, as well as an underdog kind of business story. So I just wanted to put that out there, that like, I realize within the wrestling market, people might be hesitant, but my aim wasn't to be kind of a part of that. It was to document it.
Yeah, and I guess, for me, I guess I should kind of be honest as well. Like, before I saw the documentary, I never really had that much of an interest in watching it, because, like you say, as someone that watches wrestling, you feel that you've seen all this stuff on it. But once I'd seen it, I immediately reached out to you and said, do you want to come on the show? Because I felt like it was a really interesting story of, because I guess, when you first became a fan of ECW and watched it in the 90s, and I think it was, when was it that you first started with the idea for this documentary, I guess? Let's get to that first of all. And what was the initial kind of idea that you had?
I first started watching ECW. I grew up in Allentown, Pennsylvania, which is roughly an hour outside of Center City, Philly. So it's not quite a suburb. You got to take a big highway there, but it's close enough that our TV channels were like Philadelphia stations. Mm-hmm. So I became aware of ECW pretty early on in their run. I started watching it every week by the summer of '95, and I think I had the idea for the documentary in late '99, early 2000. Because I know we started by March of 2000, and the initial idea was more of like a fan thing, because I was a fan at the time. I had gone to the ECW arena, and I kind of wanted to document. I wanted at that point to just document the kind of subculture, the carnival-like atmosphere outside of the ECW arena before shows and inside the arena, and maybe have a little bit of the history of it. I wanted to do something that was probably going to be like 30 minutes. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, we were 19 when we started. You know, and it really, we didn't have a larger aim. We had made a few mockumentaries and, you know, humorous fake documentaries. And so this was kind of the next logical step, and that's how it began.
And I guess as well, because if you're tuning into ECW in 1995, watching in 96 and 97, that was the period where they had a lot of the guys that would go on to WWF and WCW and become these kind of huge stars. In the past few years, there's been documentaries and other sorts of wrestling-related media things that have come out. Some of them have claimed that maybe WWF took attitude from ECW. Do you think, how much of that do you think is true, from being someone who watched it back then and then, I guess, seeing the WWF's attitude product? Do you think they did take a lot of it from ECW?
Well, I mean, Vince Russo was their lead writer for the WWE at that time. And he said in interviews that I'm aware of that he watched ECW and he tried to get Vince McMahon to see, you know, certain portions of it. And I don't know how successful he was in getting Vince McMahon to sit and watch tapes of it. But it seems like a very relevant, maybe relevant's not the word, but it seems like a logical thing. I would definitely say that, you know, it's fair to say WCW took a lot of wrestlers that went through ECW, while WWE took, I mean, they call it attitude, which is kind of a marketing campaign, but the spirit, the presentation, the edginess, the more quote-unquote adult like thing, which is really more like you know, teenage boy, college-age storyline stuff. Yeah. It's not really, it's not like this is Mad Men or, you know, or an Oscar-winning picture, but they definitely, I would say, yeah, they did, you know, take, to a degree, the spirit of it.
We had Raven on the show last summer, and this is before I even knew this documentary was going to be coming out and stuff. And we had asked him a little bit about ECW and about the spirit of ECW and the fans and all that sort of stuff. And his answer to us was one that I've not heard from any other ECW wrestler, and I just kind of wanted to get your take on it. He said that the ECW is looked back on more fondly now than it was at the time by the wrestlers, and that the wrestlers didn't particularly enjoy the ECW arena and the rabid fans and getting involved. Did you ever get a sense of any of that from the wrestlers, that it was just a kind of show to them, or did they really embrace, you know, how interactive it was?
Some people, yeah. It's not any of these questions and any of the things that we present in the documentary. They're very, in my opinion, very nuanced. There's a lot of subtext to things, and we don't have narration, so that's actually mentioned. It's mentioned by one of the journalists in our film, and I know wrestlers, one or two of them were like, "Oh, why would he say that? That's not true." And I was like, "Well, I've talked to people who said that was true. Not all of them feel that way, or choose to remember it that way. It's how you choose to perceive it, and how you choose to, as a wrestler, I guess, how you choose to view it, to perceive it, and to remember it. Raven's not the only one who said that. But a lot of guys feel very differently. I mean, look at the interview we have in there with the late Ted Petty. He obviously was very enamored with that fan base. You know, he very much enjoyed it. You know what I mean? So I don't think these guys, you know, have a unified view on it. I think by percentage they view it very positively, especially in hindsight. But even when I interviewed Scott Levy in 2003, he made an interesting comment that we couldn't work into the documentary. about how even, and this is before the One Night Stand pay-per-views and the Rise and Fall video came out.
Uh-huh.
He had said that it's funny now that there's such a groundswell for ECW. He said, but there wasn't at the end there when I was around until I left in September of 2000. But now it's this thing that everybody remembers fondly, and you'd think with all the people talking about it that it would have survived financially, given the people who claim to be willing. They would have been willing to go to shows, or they missed it, and they would have paid money for it.
You went along to Extreme Reunion. You were doing this filming with the various guys. How, at the end of that, at the end of those 3 days, or I guess, because at the beginning you go in and it's all this sort of excitement for what's going to happen, and, I guess some fans are hoping for a resurgence and stuff like that. And then obviously at the end, there's chance of we want refunds or whatever it was. When you walked away from that weekend, did you kind of know in your head how you wanted to portray that experience, or was that something you really had to kind of think about?
I was so beyond shell-shocked from that experience. I hadn't been on the road doing this in several years, you know what I mean? So I wasn't used to the politics of the, shooting backstage and, talking to people, and I had forgotten how impossible wrestling personnel are. I can't wait for the next project. I can't wait for something outside of wrestling. It has to be easier than dealing with like all these circuses. We were down there for 3 days, and I didn't know what we got by the end, but I was just so like I said, Kevin and I were shell shocked. In fact, after the Balls Mahoney interview, I mean, we show you pieces of that, and we show where he, kind of his juxtaposition where, at one point they filed for bankruptcy and it's been 10 days, and he's telling me on the record in 2001, they're just restructuring, and it's obvious at that point he's in denial. And then we come back and he says I was in denial, and he talks about the suicide attempt. And he went on, and I just felt, the word I always use is gutted. It was the one interview where I felt for the guy, and at the same time, I just wanted to almost run away from it, in some weird way. I didn't know what we were getting when we were filming these things. It kind of blurs together, and you feel more connected to like the feeling of your experiences than whatever you got on, whatever you recorded. Mm-hmm. So the first few days when we got home, I was just trying to decompress from the whole thing. And we happened to show raw footage to some of our friends who aren't wrestling fans. They were just curious what we were documenting down there. And when they saw it and they started commenting on like, oh my God, like the stories that they would see and that they would hear. And, then I went, okay, I guess there is something here, when you step away from it and then you start, in the month or two after that, when we started cutting it up and trying to figure out what exactly are we going to do, because there was the idea of the dual narrative, in this film didn't come until, the summertime. Mm-hmm. It didn't come until maybe a month before the Kickstarter launched in mid-August. So we still didn't know exactly what we were doing with everything.
And the last question we have, in your opinion, do you think that back in 1999 or 1998, do you think ECW ever could have got, because there was something in the documentary that made me think about this, do you think it could have ever got to the stage where it would have been as big as WCW or WWF? Because there's one quote in the film, and I can't remember who said it, so I apologise, but somebody said in the film, the great thing about coming here is that it's friends, it's family. And was that the selling point, that it was so niche, that it was friends and family? Could it just never have gotten to that point, in your opinion?
I think what made it so special and made it so unique is also what ended up destroying it. And that's a very, again, I use the word nuance because there's not one thing. It's a million things. I said it recently, like, I look at ECW as this brilliant thought experiment by Paul Heyman. And it's not just about the violence, and it's not about presentation of promos or television or what he had to work with. He's a guy who's a young guy who came out of the territory system as it was dying, who had different ideas. WCW no longer wanted to use him at that point. WWE didn't end up taking him. So he finds a guy in Philadelphia who's running a small promotion with local TV, And he has all these ideas. He's going to introduce the co-creative process with these wrestlers. He's going to allow almost no barriers, no limits. He's going to, use smaller guys. He's going to use athletic guys. He's going to use a lot of violence. He's going to use a lot of, women in quote unquote adult situations. The outreach to the fans was something that was small enough that people knew each other or got to know each other. And then it grew and it grew and it changed and it was the fan base was evolving as the product had to course correct for things that either happened behind the scenes or people leaving or, and business aspects of it. And it just it was a supernova that kind of exploded in the sky and shot out in so many different ways. The beautiful experiment gone awry kind of a thing. I don't know that it ever was meant to be this huge national success. And I think that's okay. I don't think that you should judge everything monetarily. Obviously you want to get paid, but I don't think the success should be judged by, because it went out of business, it was a failure, or because, it was a niche thing, it should be dismissed. I think that artistically, it had its handprint on a lot of things that came out of that. It's kind of like an artistic period. I went to school in art school, and one of the classes I had to take, even though I was a writer, was, modernism, and they would talk about all these periods of art and what's indicative of this period and how it moved, and there was a reaction to it, and I think it makes a lot of sense that ROH kind of came out of ECW and was a completely different thing. It was an artistic reaction. That for them to survive, they would have had to evolve, and that's a huge what if, both business-wise and personnel-wise and fan-base-wise. If Paul Heyman could have pulled back and said, all right, the hardcore thing's phasing out, we're going to do something a little different. Now, he would have had, the fun, you could really go down this rabbit hole for a while, because he probably would have had CM Punk earlier in his career. He would have had a guy like Colt Cabana. He would have had a lot of those ROH guys and people that popped up in TNA in the early days. So he could have done something, because there was a glut of people that came out of that boom period when wrestling was so popular in the United States in the late 90s. Everybody and their mother got trained, which means that there were a lot of there were a lot more wrestlers than usual. And it also meant that there was a lot of different styles to pick from and a lot of different types of people. If he could have latched onto that, and I think he would have, and he could have gotten his fan base to buy into it, or at least enough people to stay while drawing in new people, there's a chance he could have, done something, but then what about TV contracts? What about the overhead of the contracts they had to pay? There's a lot of what ifs.
It's certainly interesting to think about. I said at the beginning of the interview, I think it's definitely worth checking out. It's a great documentary on the story of ECW, and like you mentioned, it, not necessarily the history, but the story. And hopefully people do give it a chance. So how can people buy the documentary or watch it?
Sure, you can go to barbedwirecity.com. You can order a DVD. We've been trying to get the direct downloads up. I'm excited about that. Because then you don't have to ship anything and it's instantaneous, and people like that. Yeah. We're trying to get the direct downloads in the store, and I thought it would be this morning. I've been saying that for the last 2 days. The template that the store that we use has was just slightly, it wasn't, quote unquote idiot proof. It was one of those things where we could see people going like, I don't understand this, because you'd have to right click something, and we wanted to make it where you hit a button and it downloads and you pay, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So we'll have direct downloads, hopefully by the end of the day. Regardless, the DVDs up there, there's t-shirts and posters too, barbedwirecity.com. And then if you're in America, and you're not doing anything this Saturday at noon, we're having a New York premiere in Manhattan at the Gramercy Theater, which is a really nice place. Information about that is up on barbedwirecity.com also. Tickets you can get through Gramercy City, the Gramercy Theater box office, or you can go through Ticketmaster.
Well, yeah. Hopefully, if you're in the US, definitely check out the premiere. But thank you for coming on, because it's a documentary that as soon as I finished watching it, the first thing I did was go online to find out who I could contact to speak to get on the show. Yeah, because it's a fascinating documentary.
One at a time. We'll get. We're earning people one at a time who give us a chance and then go, oh wow, that was different from what I thought. Okay, And if you get the subtext of a lot of the things that we're showing and presenting, it's not just an informational documentary. That wasn't the goal. It was a very human story, very interesting what these people think or say, and the things that are left unsaid at times.
Thank you very much, John. I hope you've enjoyed the interview, and thank you very much for joining us.
All right, thank you so much, Kenny.
Thanks. Take care. Bye.